So, just over a week ago, I put out this video on Scotland's reforms to the Gender Recognition Act and the flurry of TERF Ls which followed. In particular, this one from the now infamous Flashing Lady, which we should watch again for academic purposes.
You will not be decent, then I will be indecent! Get it right up, you!
Now, the reform that our bonny old lassie was so upset about is a streamlining of the gender recognition process which made it easier for trans people to change their name and gender on their birth, marriage, and death certificates. Beyond that, it also changed, basically nothing. The procedure for changing details on other documents, such as driver's licenses, passports, medical documents, are the same as they always have been. Our last video also argued the kind of obvious point that birth and marriage certificates are not the secret keys to women's spaces that J.K. Rowling and friends seem to think they are. All the same, a mere 4 hours after this video went up, the Conservative Party in Westminster decided to use the nuclear option and block the law under the never-before-used Section 35 of the Scotland Act. For the first time in history, a Scottish law was blocked by the UK government since the Parliament was formed in 1999. And it was over trans people. Barring these 11 MPs who voted to keep the Scottish reforms, the rest of the Labour Party abstained, and their fearless leader, Keith the Pain Train Starmer, agreed that the legislation should be modernised, but then also argued that 16 and 17-year-olds were too young for a completely reversible change to a couple of documents. So the Section 35 order was passed, but this might not be the end of the story. It seems likely that the Scottish Government will be able to challenge the move, especially if it turns out that our imperial masters might have acted irrationally. Section 35 does not give Westminster the right to intervene whenever they want. One of the requirements is that the Secretary of State must have reasonable grounds to believe there would be an adverse effect on the operation of British law. What adverse effect could they be referring to here? Well, according to our Prime Minister, and basically everyone else on his side, the primary concern is around the impact the reforms will have on women's and children's safety. Once again, the concern is over women's spaces. Now, I know a lot of concerned bystanders might think that the pro-trans response here is to just dismiss women's safety completely, but that's not the point. The problem is that this is what you might call a red herring fallacy. So when I was looking for this picture, I learned that the phrase red herring actually comes from an old 19th century story about using the smell of a herring to distract dogs from chasing a rabbit. Wow, that's so interesting. Anyway, the point here is not that women's safety doesn't matter, but that it has nothing to do with gender recognition laws. And it isn't hard to see why. Because all you need to ask is, how many spaces are there where people need to show their birth or marriage certificates in order to gain access? Contrary to what our current Women and Equalities Minister might say, it's obviously not bathrooms, and anyone who thinks it is should stop watching this video immediately and eat their entire weight in grass. Is it women's shelters? Well, if it was, then how the fuck was joyless Krampus Rowling able to announce that she would be opening a shelter which excludes trans women right after the reforms were passed? It's because she's allowed to, and the GRA reform didn't change that. Maybe told on your own side a bit there, Joanne. Is it equal pay? No. Trans people already have their own protections for that, and pretty much any other form of discrimination under the 2010 Equality Act. Well, what about our notorious fanny flasher who brought up the question of women's prisons? Well, it turns out she was asked this question in an interview with Channel 4. And her answer was interesting.
Male violence against women is a pandemic. There's a lot of women out there that are living with significant trauma and fear, and their right to be in a male-free space must be respected.
But what has that got to do with allowing trans people to self-identify?
Nothing at all.
Sorry, what? Okay, so I know there are some more propagandistic YouTubers who would just pause the clip there and use it to land some sick-ass dunks, but we should let her finish the sentence.
Nothing at all, except where the two requirements clash.
Right, so she doesn't specify exactly where women's safety collides with trans self-ID, but to her credit, she does seem to be the only one who came close to making an argument. Although that argument might have been overshadowed by all of the minge mania. But in this clip, she brought up the concern of women's prisons. In our last video, we explained how this concern is completely overblown and how trans women are far more likely to be the victims of male violence than they are to attack cis women. Because, you know, misogynists don't exactly make exceptions for trans women. Like, it's not as if a guy is going to sexually harass someone, find out she's trans, and then go, "Oh no, sorry, I thought you were one of those, cisgender lassies. Oh shit, alright, no bother pal, you go about your day, alright." But it turns out that prisons do at least have some connection to gender recognition certificates. And since this is most likely going to turn into a legal battle, we should do some investigating. Now, when I say the decision-making process in Scottish prisons is kind of related to GRCs, I do really mean kind of. A couple of weeks ago, the Deputy Chief Executive for the Scottish Prison Service was asked to comment on the reforms. He was sure to remind people that there are currently only 16 trans prisoners in the entire country, and half of the trans women are still in male prisons. He said that he doesn't see the reform as having a major impact, especially if it's only applying to 16 prisoners out of over 7,000. And this is most likely because decision-making for trans inmates is decided on a case-by-case basis involving multiple professionals and a multidisciplinary risk assessment for which GRCs are only one aspect. Unfortunately, this article doesn't say how important GRCs are to these decisions, so I thought I'd try and find out myself. So I read the Gender Identity and Reassignment Policy for Scottish prisons, all 34 pages of it, and it does look quite progressive. They see the need for trans people to have single cells as a priority. They make sure rub downs and body searches are done in accordance with the gender in which the person is currently living. They have access to transition-related items like prosthetics, binders, wigs, and packers. They acknowledge non-binary people. They have strict regulations around privacy. They have a procedure for people who come out as trans whilst they're in custody. They mention the Gender Recognition Act and how GRCs are not required in order to have protection from gender reassignment discrimination, so that's interesting. And here they even have this one-page flowchart table thing outlining a typical gender reassignment journey. This grey part is where they seem to consider accommodation changes, and this includes stages like permanently changing names and pronouns, changing gender on documents except birth certificates, being on HRT, using trans-related equipment. Then there's surgeries, and right at the bottom of this list is gender recognition certificates. So even under the reformed law, prisoners with GRCs will have already had to go through a stage of their transition where accommodational changes are being considered. Namely, this one. And the reforms also wouldn't have changed the fact that trans people with GRCs would have still had to go through other forms of risk assessment. That's why this person, who had 2 convictions of rape, only spent 72 hours in a women's prison where she was kept in a segregated space before being transferred to a men's prison in Edinburgh. Now, given that these 72 hours were a risk assessment period, I would imagine the fact that she raped 2 women was probably more central than the question of what words were written on her birth certificate, but that's just me. So that was a whole bunch of things I never thought I'd know about prisons, but it looks like the point still remains. This is a proxy attack against a trans rights policy that seems to affect pretty much no one except those who are seeking legal gender recognition. And thanks to the rabid culture warrior bloodlust of anti-trans activists, it led to Scottish law being overridden for the first time in the Parliament's history. All over a demographic that makes up 0.5% of the population. Of course, our fiery pepperpot of a First Minister will most likely be mounting a legal challenge against this. Right-wing Scottish nationalists will continue to sweat over whether they want to get mad at Westminster for undermining Scottish sovereignty, or at trans people for being a thing. There have been protests against this move in both Scotland and England. I went to one myself and it seems that trans people are pretty well supported. I guess I should comment on the French Revolution themed elephant in the room that went viral, namely this picture of a protester holding up a sign reading "Decapitate TERFs." Now, if you've been around in politics for long enough, you'll know that a lot of people who blew this up are only doing so in bad faith. I don't expect the who's who of gender criticals were batting an eye when one of their big names was bragging about handing out badges saying "Kill men now, ask me how," but all the same, this is obviously not a good idea. If you disagree, you're wrong, and a metric ton of grass would still not be enough for you. If you have even the slightest consideration for public opinion, then this doesn't help anyone, and it's also kind of illegal. Like, is this really worth you getting fined or possibly jailed? Obviously, you can't account for every single protester. It's not unusual for agitators to do stuff like this, and I think it's only a minority of people who support this, but to an outsider, it isn't always clear. I've personally been to protests where speakers have said things like, "The only good TERF is a dead TERF," and the crowd just cheers like it's nothing. And it's frustrating because TERFs will always cause more harm to trans people than the other way around, but this is definitely not the way to communicate that, especially if you're at an event where you're going to be in front of journalists and police officers. From my own experience, and I used to protest quite a lot when I was younger, it's always worth calling this kind of thing out when you see it. Because 9 out of 10 times, people are usually quite reasonable when you confront them, and even when they're not, the rest of the crowd will most likely take your side. You know, believe it or not, most people oppose extrajudicial executions when they're faced with the choice, so yeah, that was a long digression. Thanks for watching Trans Rights. If you liked this video, or if you didn't like this video and you want to persuade me to make different content, well, you should support me on Patreon by following the link in the description. Do it now. Bye.